Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Lunatics Radio Hour podcast. I'm Abby Branker, sitting here with Alan Kudan.
Hello.
And today we are so thrilled to be joined by Jenn Wexler and Sean Redlitz. Welcome.
Hello.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Thank you guys so much for being here. I'm sure people are aware of who you are, but just in case anyone isn't, Jenn Wexler is an incredible filmmaker, writer, director. Sean, also very much in the horror world. Writer, marketer, worked at Shudder for many years, and we're thrilled to be able to talk to them today about horror and about how their most recent film ties into demonic summoning. So, Jenn, let's start with your credits a little bit here. So you were the writer and director of The Ranger in the Sacrifice Game, which you co-wrote with Sean. And these are two incredibly, and I'm not saying this to gas you up, but like really influential horror films, I feel like, in the indie horror world community. So it's very exciting to be able to talk to you.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. And I'm excited to be here to chat.
So we do something a little bit cringy for most of our guests on the podcast, which is kind of ask a few icebreaker questions just to kind of get everybody acclimated with who you guys are. So the first thing that I always ask is if you guys have ever had any sort of paranormal or unexplained experience in your life.
I feel like I've always been on the search for them. Mm-hmm. When I was young, around 10 years old, which was the time that I was seeing The Craft for the first time, my friends and I would like hang out in the local graveyard after school. Cool. And we'd have slumber parties and do like light as a feather, stiff as a board. And I feel like it worked, but at the same time, it was like 8 of us all carrying the girl. So maybe it didn't actually work. But in our like 10-year-old minds, we were like, oh my God, she's so light. Obviously, this is working. And we'd also do like seances and play with a Ouija board. And I contacted George Washington once, obviously, as you do when you're 10. Yeah.
Can you tell that story?
Yeah. I said, hey, George Washington, if you're here, turn on the TV. But the TV was already on, so obviously I had to go turn it off first. So I walked over to turn it off, and then a couple moments later, turned back on by itself. It's possible that I had accidentally pressed it twice really quick, but I don't think I did that. I think that it just turned on by itself.
Okay, so yeah, I'm glad we probed because that feels, a little spooky.
This is our first George Washington horror story.
Oh, yes. Well, also, the night before, it was my 10-year-old birthday party, and I had all these girls over my house. And the night before, we spoke to Hitler.
Wow. And from one extreme to the other, really. All the historic figures.
And half the girls got scared and went home.
You know, history class would have been so much more interesting if there were just seances interspersed with the history lessons.
Oh my God, why not talk to who you're learning about directly?
Yeah.
An excellent lesson on primary versus secondary history sources.
There you go.
There you go. Sean, what about you?
I also have never had a true paranormal experience. We live in a building that's over 100 years old, so I have to assume if there's a good chance maybe somebody died there could be ghosts. So I allow the things that lurk in my peripheral vision to possibly be ghosts.
Okay.
You know, was that a lamp over there, or was that a ghost girl sitting on the mantle? I don't know. It could have been. But if she's a ghost girl sitting on the mantle, she's welcome. It's her place as much as mine. So, I try to give the ghosts their space if they're real, or give them space in my imagination if they're not.
Fair enough. So you guys are both open-minded to it, but nothing sort of concrete has ever happened.
On the Sacrifice Game set, we shot in this old abbey, and some of the crew said that they were experiencing some ghostly things. Like the producers were in a room in the middle of the night, and suddenly all these candles were just knocked down by themselves. And other people said there was weird lighting going on in the basement, like lights turning on and off by themselves. But I was very much, and I think this is like just kind of who I am as a person in terms of paranormal stuff. I totally believe in it, but I'm also like, don't fucking get in my headspace.
Yeah,
so especially then, I was like, I'm trying to direct. Don't get in my headspace. But just in general, I'm like, yo, if you're out there, I'm cool with you, but let's just like keep our distance from each other.
Fair enough. So in terms of horror, because you guys, I will say, Sean, you and I met many years ago now. I can't quite
2018.
2018. And what really brought us together, besides working on a project at work, was our love of horror. So I know that you have a love of horror. Obviously, Jenn, you do. So first of all, what drew you both to the genre? Because I think you guys both specifically are quite invested in horror when it comes to filmmaking.
In my particular case, as a kid, it was always those movies that were on TV after school that I watched. It was the Universal Monster movies. It was the Vincent Price movies. It was the Hammer horror movies. Yeah. Very often I would find those things. Even Planet of the Apes, I would say, was kind of scary to me as a kid. Yeah. So I fell in love with that. I had monster posters. I was really invested in Dracula. I had a whole Dracula getup for Halloween as a 12-year-old, 11-year-old. So that was really a big influence on me at the time. And then professionally, I've had opportunities to work. Maybe I was drawn to them, or maybe I just got lucky, but I have had opportunities to work in science fiction and fantasy and horror and television and film. I worked at Sci-Fi back in the day. I worked at another streamer / network called FearNet that unfortunately is no longer with us, but was a fun place to be. That's where Jenn and I originally met. And I got to spend 4 great years at Shudder. So it's been really a privilege to both be a horror fan and in the horror industry.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I fell in love with horror when I was 5 years old. I watched Are You Afraid of the Dark? I became obsessed with that TV show. And I know I have friends who have been introduced to horror through people, through parents, through friends. But for me, it was always such a solo experience. And I think that's why I gravitated towards it, because it was this special thing that belonged to me, watching Are You Afraid of the Dark by myself when I was a kid, and then later watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer and all the late 90s teen slashers. Sometimes I would watch them with friends, but really it was this spiritual experience that aligned with my going into adolescence. That was I was discovering this world by myself, and so it became this really special thing to me. Interesting to hear of Sean's solo experience as well with horror. I think there's just something about it where you can connect to the genre on your own. You don't necessarily need a community when you have that initial gateway experience. But then later on, when I was in college, I started doing an internship for FearNet, which once I graduated later became my first official real job. I worked in the marketing department as a marketing coordinator. And honestly, I've never had since graduation, since that became my first real job, I've never had a normal job. I've always worked in horror in one way or another. First I was at FearNet for a couple of years. Then I worked at Larry Fessenden's production company, Glass Eye Pix, for several years. And now I'm making horror movies. So I know what it is to have before all that, I had normal jobs. I worked in restaurants and stores and all the things. But since then, I haven't had a normal job, and I don't want to go back to normal jobs.
Fair enough.
And while we're talking about the FearNet days, shout out to our friend Drew Daywalt, who is now a very successful children's book author, but has also made some amazing horror shorts, including some you've definitely seen. The one about the woman who thinks she's in bed with somebody, but turns out there's a very creepy. Anyway, I won't spoil all of it, but while we were both at FearNet, Drew was making these shorts with his friends, very kind of guerrilla style, and inspired, I think, Jenn to take a whack at it, because it was something we'd talked about for a long time. But you often wait for somebody to unlock the keys to the kingdom for you. Okay, now you can be a filmmaker. But really, to be a filmmaker, you just have to go out and make films, with whatever you can, whatever you have. And it was really exciting to see Jenn kind of get that first toe in the water, and then learn so much more with Glass Eye Pix, and now kind of doing her own thing and also helping others along the way.
Yeah. And what's really interesting to me, actually, so my experience with horror and why I'm drawn to it, I think is a little bit different from what you guys both said, which is that I have this very intense fear growing up, and I was very afraid all the time. And despite that, my family was really into horror, abnormally so. So it's kind of this weird juxtaposition. But when you were talking about your solo experience with horror, I was just thinking, you were the bravest kid. I was upstairs having a mental breakdown because I could hear the X-Files theme song that my parents were watching downstairs. So you guys are both, I feel very brave. I don't know that everybody has that experience with their solo discovery of horror. It feels very adventurous to me.
How about you, Alan?
I always liked horror. I didn't fall in love with horror until I met Abby. And that just opened the whole realm of possibilities. Kind of similarly, it was always like a very personal thing because I didn't have anybody, like, unless you have someone that's like gung-ho about horror, it's kind of tough to be like, yeah, guys, let's sit down and watch this like awful gory slasher. You know, most people don't like that. But I did. So it was like just something that every so often I would dabble on my own. But then like once you have a partner that is gung-ho about it, it's like super fun. And in terms of being able to like crack into making horror, I've always felt that horror lends itself very well to shorts, whereas not a lot of genres do that. Like I feel like short films, like the biggest categories are either just like horror or drama. And a drama usually serves a purpose to like, it's telling a bigger story. It's trying to tell a bigger story. It's leading up to the feature version of it. Well, like a horror short can be like a super self-contained thing. It's like, cool, on to the next, let's do it. And that's just always felt like a very accessible way to break in.
And when you're watching horror as a kid, it serves a particular purpose. Usually it's either because you have fears and anxieties in your life that it's helping you kind of cope with, because it gives you a safe outlet for them, or because you're, lonely and interested in mysterious, weird stuff, or supernatural stuff, and it gives you an avenue into that. It kind of lets you test yourself in a really safe way as a kid. Some people like roller coasters. Some people, jump off the roof off the garage roof. Horror was something that I could tap into and push myself, but also feel safe doing so. And then when you get to be an adult, especially if you're an adult who makes films or is interested in watching a lot of films, you realize how open the genre is for just about any kind of storytelling you want to do. You want to tell a comedy, you want to tell a romantic story, you want to tell a really deep psychological story. Horror can go to places that traditional dramas, traditional comedies can't. Now, it's not everybody's cup of tea, and sometimes they go to places some audiences don't want to go to. But if you watch a lot of horror, or if you're friends with somebody who really knows the genre and can guide you to the things that really resonate with the kinds of horror you're interested in, that takes you far. I'm not somebody who was super deep into slashers, so that was never my thing. But give me, a folk horror or a world in which the characters are doomed from the start and you know it, like Blair Witch.
Yeah.
I just eat that stuff up.
Yeah, yeah.
Also, as you get older, you start to realize there's a whole community of people just like you. People gravitated towards this stuff. Like, I didn't feel like I felt like I was the person in my friend group when I was a kid that was like, let's watch a horror movie. But then obviously as I got older and the internet became a thing and I started going in chat rooms and all the things, I started to meet other people who were into horror. And then certainly now, I mean, it's so easy to find the horror community, I feel like.
Yeah. The other interesting thing that I thought about when you were talking, Sean, is that there's studies that they do, and probably most people know this, but I find it really interesting. There's studies that they do around like spikes in horror, like when the general public is interested, and it's always like the Great Depression, World War II, right? Like when there's like really tragic, terrible things happening in the world, which I know is steady state for a lot of the time recently. But it's because there's people find like an escape, like a safe escape in horror when they need that kind of release, right? And like going to a theater or on a roller coaster, like you said, is even for us adults sometimes is a way to kind of cope with what's happening in the world, in a safe, confined space.
I just can't get over the fact that you were able to watch Are You Afraid of the Dark on your own.
Really?
It's terrifying.
Oh my, it was really scary, but it was like some of the most exciting emotional adventures I went on as a kid were just like watching Are You Afraid of the Dark?
I've recently tried to dive back into Goosebumps, and that's too much.
Goosebumps is also
It's
intense.
a lot scarier than I remember it being.
Yeah.
Well, for our amusement park episode a few months ago, what was the name of it?
One Day in Horrorland.
One Day in Horrorland. He was actually legitimately like struggling to get through it.
It's terrifying.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, I know this is like the most obnoxious question, but can you give us just like a handful of your like desert island horror films?
The Shining, definitely. Suspiria.
Desert Island is a really good way to phrase it because I get asked a lot, like, what are some of your favorite horror films? And those, I have a lot to pull from, recent, classic. But the kinds that you want to watch and rewatch and kind of live and relive over and over again, Return of the Living Dead would probably be on that because it's so entertaining to me. it gave us the zombies that eat brains, which people don't always realize was not always part of the mythology.
Yeah.
Send more cops.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one I think I can watch endlessly. I have others that are like, that leave me a little more shaken, or I might want to set them aside for a few weeks or months or years before I revisit them. But that's one I can watch over and over again. And I really love Dead and Buried, which has Dan O'Bannon in common. He didn't really write Dead and Buried. He's a credited writer on that. I think that was just to help them get the financing. He acknowledges that he was not the major force behind that. But Dead and Buried, people have talked about the Sacrifice Game as having some good twists in it. Dead and Buried to me has the quintessential twist and great ending of all time in horror. If it's not one you've seen, I'm not going to spoil it for you here today. But essentially, the premise is that a sheriff who used to be a cop in the big city returns back to his small, I want to say New England, but basically coastal foggy town, and where weird murders are taking place in which mobs of people are descending upon the victim and filming, photographing, otherwise documenting the murders as they happen. But you don't know why.
Wow. Okay. Well, we'll have to watch it.
Yeah, I haven't even heard of this movie.
Directed by Gary Sherman, who also did Poltergeist 3 and a lot of other great stuff. He did a Raw Meat, which is a London-based subway underground horror. So he's a good guy.
I also, just going back, I'm also, usually I'm asked, what are your favorite horror movies? So I just have this list that I just go to. But I agree, phrasing it as like desert island, you don't have anything else. So you're going to be watching these movies over and over again. Makes me think about this question a little differently. And so I would answer with movies I have literally watched over and over again, which include Heathers. I've watched that movie probably more than any other movie I've ever watched in my life. And also Halloween.
Yeah. We're similar, Jen. Halloween is my ultimate horror film. Like just every year since I was born, I've watched that movie on Halloween. Like it's just like my family's, everything you need to know about my family is that.
It says a lot about Abby. She's like 2 years old and they're making her watch Halloween.
And I'm like,
it says a lot about her family. It's a pretty cool family.
Yeah, they are. My mom is like into the Universal it was obvious that I would end up a big fanatic of horror.
I'm going to throw out one more though.
Please.
Alien. It's got your sci-fi. It's got your sort of monster in a haunted house, except it's a spaceship. It's got phenomenal cast, great acting. Can't beat that one.
It checks a lot of boxes.
It does.
We're overdue for a deep dive. We've been trying to do it for a few years now on the podcast, and because every once in a while we'll pick a franchise and we'll watch every film and we'll do like this big deep dive into the history of it, usually around Halloween. And Alien has been kind of floating around, so it's one of Alan's favorite franchises. I'm less familiar with it beyond the first one, so hopefully soon we'll get to it.
I hope so.
The other thing I wanted to say about Heathers too is that I have a very specific love for academic horror, and it's very prevalent, I feel like, in a lot of novels, but Heathers is one of those like rare films where it kind of evokes that like academic world of like being on a specific campus and like having things devolve in a way, like this like teen drama type way that always happens in these like academic horror novels and stories, and I love it so much.
I love academic horror. I don't know how much that term is used.
I've never heard that term before.
But I love it, and I'm going to start
I wrote a little
sharing
blog post about some of my favorite academic horror novels. I'll send it to you because I'm curious if you have additional ones I'm missing.
I feel like usually one would say like teen horror or like slashers or whatever, or we've been saying with Sacrifice Game, boarding school horror.
Yeah, yes.
But academic horror is just a great term that I think we should use more often.
Yes. Yeah, and it's almost like you want to watch it in the fall, like when you would be returning to school and the leaves are turning and you're on a campus, you're away from home, and it's all of that's happening. It's like a contained universe. Yeah.
Halloween H2O is academic horror.
You talk about Halloween H2O all the time. The Faculty, I know, is on your short list of favorite movies.
I love The Faculty.
We also love The Faculty here. Yeah.
Also Disturbing Behavior.
Oh.
So good. Katie Holmes.
Okay. I'll have to watch that one.
Speaking about just, horror being a very personal thing, every so often, like, you'll meet people that, you've known them for a while, but, like, you've never discussed horror. When they find out that, like, you're into it, it just, like, the floodgates open, and they're like, oh, my God, I've never had someone to talk to about this. And this happened a little while back when there was someone that I've been working with for years. And then when it came up, the fact that we have like a horror podcast is like, oh my God, have you seen The Faculty? Like, yeah, it's great. And then we just bonded over The Faculty for a while. It's like these little things that just like connect people.
It's so good.
Yeah.
It's just such a well-made, well-written movie. It's really smart. Good job, Robert Rodriguez.
While there's so many endless great horror films in the world, I want to talk a little bit more about The Sacrifice Game, which came out in December of 2023. Is that right?
Correct.
It's a little bit Christmassy, but don't let that stop you from watching it now. If you we're not going to spoil anything because, probably not everybody listening has watched it. But if you haven't watched it, please go watch it. It's on Shudder currently. Is it anywhere else?
It's now on VOD. So
And
Amazon,
VOD.
most of the places you rent a movie. you can find
Amazing.
it.
Okay. And I'm just going to read the log line here to kind of illustrate in a contained way. It's bad enough that boarding school students Samantha and Clara can't go home for the holidays, but things take a deadly turn when a murderous gang arrives on their doorstep. So, Sean and Jenn, you both wrote this film together. Could you describe for us a little bit about the essence of the movie?
I like to talk about the movie like Last House on the Left by way of Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
We love that. And one of the reasons why we're talking about The Sacrifice Game this month, as opposed to every other month, is that we're just coming off of a big series on the podcast about demonic summoning. So one thing I want to talk about a little bit is kind of the lore and the rules of the world, because you do have entities and demons to some extent. Again, I don't want to give too much away, but one thing that Alan and I talk about a lot, because Alan specifically loves films with rules. And so it doesn't seem arbitrary when things are happening. And I think The Sacrifice Game does that really well. But can you tell us a little bit about how you came up with like the parameters of the world, the rules of the world, the lore of this kind of legend and how it all came to be?
We're very influenced by a lot of these kinds of movies, and we love horror. We watch horror movies together all the time. We're very aware of all the tropes. And something that's really exciting to me as a writer and a horror fan is when you can find ways to take the tropes that everybody knows and then twist them in new ways that we haven't quite seen before. So when we were writing, that was something that Sean and I were really excited about doing, playing with the sacrifice trope.
Yeah.
The trope of, demonic sacrifice, virgin sacrifice. We've seen this in horror so many times, and some of the movies we were influenced by include like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. And so it was just kind of gathering everything that we know about this trope and playing with it, and not to give too much away, but just to say that you have this gang of Manson-esque cultists who come to this boarding school, and they're there because they believe they can raise a demon in this space. So it was really fun to think about everything that goes into that from, that's why I mentioned Last House on the Left. You have this home invasion and this gang of bad guys who think that they have all the power in the world and they can do whatever they want, and they're going to get more power when they raise this demon. And then things take wild turns once they actually get to the place.
And in terms of the writing of it and the creation of the mythology and the lore behind it, I'm with Alan. I love when there's a good solid concept, a cool concept that I haven't seen before. Ideally, in a movie, we, as Jenn said, we watch a lot of horror, so we've seen a lot of things. So we wanted to do something that was different. But I also love it when they don't over-explain it. I don't need to have my hand held. I don't need to have the movie stop and have a long expository passage where we talk through all of the nitty-gritty. But I think that as an audience, you can sense when a filmmaker knows the lore and gives you enough tidbits so that then they hang together and it feels consistent, but is not over, slowing the movie down or weighing it down with too much of that. So we tried to keep that balance. And there are a lot of clues in terms of what the origins of this entity might be and what happened along the way and what's happening now as we catch up with them in the movie. But a lot of that might not be apparent on first viewing because it's sort of teased and sprinkled in different places. So our hope is that if you don't necessarily come up with exactly the idea that we had, you at least come up with an idea of your own that fits those breadcrumbs and makes sense to you and makes the world feel like it's bigger than what you're seeing in the movie.
Yeah. Yeah. And did you guys do any research into like demonic legend or mythology in general, or do you feel like you like have seen enough horror that you were able to kind of do that without diving into like textbooks on mythology?
I read up on the Lesser Key of Solomon demons, and I didn't want to base our demon on one of those because going back to earlier in our conversation, I actually like do believe in this stuff, and I didn't want to piss off a real demon, and I didn't want to accidentally summon a real demon.
Or their publicist.
So we made our own invention, but stole traits of some of those demons. And that was really fun, like creating our demon. His name is Sirach. It was really fun. And when we were making the movie, I make lookbooks for like all the different departments, and it was really fun putting all that together for like our makeup, effects, and prosthetics department, and being like, this is what their sigil looks like, and this is the history. This is what you can expect if you summon a demon. I've also spent like way too many hours on the internet just going through weird forums and reading creepypastas and just seeing other people's experiences of trying to summon demons. And I've also been really interested in the idea of, first of all, to summon a demon, usually these rituals are really complicated. And I would say our ritual is also complicated. Like, it's really hard to do our ritual. You need the exact right circumstances for our ritual that we've created to work. It's really complicated to summon demons. And I'm also interested in the idea that, like, you could summon a demon and not even know if it worked or not. And suddenly there's this, like, force in your life that's not... things are different than how they used to be. So that was really attractive to me when we were developing this.
It's a very interesting concept. You know, from like classical film, I guess, when the demon summoning happens, the portal opens and like the big thing comes out. But I guess, yeah, through like, you know, like specifically like witch trial texts and everything, like when the demon comes, you don't know. It's just because, yeah, things are now different. That's such an interesting concept.
And there's a lot of like trickster demons. Yeah. There's a lot of them who like to fuck with you. So if you happen to summon one of those, then you could be in a lot of trouble.
And as Jenn mentioned, we have a somewhat complicated ceremony that we feel like carries the weight of what these sort of Lesser Key of Solomon kind of classical demon stuff does. But really, like they go way beyond. It's weeks of preparation, and there's a movie that I'm sure you've covered or are covering as part of this series, A Dark Song, that is all about how to summon a demon and why. And it's beyond esoteric. It's so much work, but it's such a great movie, and it is maybe the best one on the list of demon movies that I've seen in terms of really getting at what the sort of medieval scholars who thought they knew how to do this were up to. Ours is a sort of light version of that by that standard, but still a lot more involved than maybe your typical movie where they just say a few magic words and a demon, you know, they draw a pentagram, say a few words and a demon pops up.
One of the reason why I really like specific rules in lore is because you can have a seemingly omnipotent being of some supernatural force that breaks all of these conventions about like how do you defeat this thing. But once you put it in some kind of box, you've now given it some kind of critical flaw. And then like that's how you get your overarching story where the protagonist can now rise to the occasion and, you know, fight back against this seemingly unbeatable thing. And one thing that always like kills sequels for me is when they establish the rules of something and then they just say, and then you have some new director coming in for like, I'm thinking of like Nightmare on Elm Street, like 5 or something, but that's a bad example because they still adhere to the rules pretty well. It's a great franchise for rules. But you know, they throw that away and it's like, actually this thing can just break the rules now. You're kind of starting from scratch because now it's, you know, quote unquote scarier.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of like Hellraiser, but I think those are the kinds of things we love. And I think that's true of anything. Like if you put anything in a box, like even when you're working on a creative project, having any kind of limitation always like breeds more creativity, I feel like.
Yeah, and having an antagonist or a monster that's not all powerful, that has constraints and sets around what they can do, is helpful. And not every horror franchise has to do this, but when you can create a monster that also has an agenda, that has a point of view, that has feelings and opinions, and those could be even changed over time. They're not just set. Freddy is by far my favorite slasher, but I feel like he's got one thing on his mind, which is killing teens. And that's all he's really there for, and he doesn't really care too much, and that doesn't change too much. In our particular movie, we wanted to play around with an idea of like, is the monster necessarily evil? Is the monster just out for themselves? Are there other things governing what's going on? So that's some of the fun we had.
I love when the monster becomes a little bit of an anti-hero. Anytime you can root for the monster and not simply because the characters are just so unlikable. When you have likable characters and a likable monster, but still everyone's like at odds and it's scary. It's difficult to pull off. And I felt like the Sacrifice Game really, really did it. And
thank you.
Because we watched it separately because Abby was able to go to the screening. And when I was like watching it by myself, Abby was in the other room, and I'm just like kept like calling out like, they're doing it.
Yay. I
came home and the first thing I said to Alan was, you're going to love the Sacrifice Game. There are so many rules. And then the next day he watched it and he loved it. And it was great because we watched it in December and it was Christmas themed and it was perfect.
Yay.
We do a lot of like holiday horror stuff at Lunatics, so it was ideal.
And we said it in 71 because we felt like, that was the right time to tell the story. But so many of our influences, and Jenn has already mentioned Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, you can absolutely put Black Christmas on that list, were from that era. So it just really clicked for us as to set it then as well.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing to talk about too a little bit, just as filmmakers and writers, how you guys think about influences, because I think for me, right, it's hard to separate that out because we love horror. We watch so much horror and so much film in general. And as we work on our own films, it's just there. It's in your brain, right? But I know other filmmakers who like specifically won't watch films that are really close to what they're working on because, they feel like it's too close. I wonder how you guys think about that.
Most of the time I embrace the influences and I like having like the library of films in my head. And even if a movie comes out like right now while I'm writing something, by the time the thing I'm writing is done and then actually gets financed and then actually goes into production, like we're talking like 4 years from now, if we're lucky, it's actually coming out.
Yeah.
So by then, that thing that came out right now is again part of the genre that you're working in. Sometimes I do feel like, okay, that's too close for me to be watching right now. But ultimately, like, I don't wait that long. I wait maybe a couple months and then I check it out. I like having those influences. And what's really cool is like when I'm writing, if I'm writing in a certain genre, first of all, I'll be like, okay, this meets this. So that's like top of mind. And then as I'm writing, I'm like, oh my God, in this scene, it's like if I take a little bit of this and then I mash it with this, but it's its own thing here. That's what this scene is. So I think it's like a really fun part of the process, like pulling from various places.
Yeah.
And it may seem heretical to say this on a horror podcast, but I think that, if you're a horror fan and you want to make horror entertainment, watch and steal from non-horror movies too.
Yeah.
And, make them your own. Don't just copy stuff. But, there have been some great examples recently. Obviously, a Happy Death Day franchise and was it Freaky? Are great examples of like pulling from body switch movies or time loop movies, but saying, what if we make them horror? Whatever your favorite movie is, it could be Fast and Furious. All right, well, what's a horror element that I could add to that would make it exciting? You love musicals, great. Anne and the Apocalypse is so. When you can bring everybody that is working in the horror space has also probably seen and loved the same horror movies you have, but they haven't necessarily watched the other genres that really fascinate you, whether it's Westerns, boxing movies, whatever it is. If you can find something from those other spheres, documentaries that inspire you and you think, what if I put a horror element in this? What does it give me? You could go to some really cool places.
Yeah. And to your point earlier, sometimes it is purely just a horror film, but so often, especially now, I feel like it's a horror plus, right? It's a horror drama, it's a horror comedy, it's a horror zombie film, it's a horror, whatever it is. There's like endless combinations that, and as they should, right? Because why not? But horror can be layered with so many other things. And so to your point, like pulling inspiration from anywhere and everywhere makes perfect sense.
I am just so excited to see a horror street racing movie or a horror boxing movie now.
Well, you want to work on it?
That sounds amazing. Yeah.
After we're done recording, we'll go brainstorm.
Sorry, I'm so distracted thinking about this now.
Demon car? Is the car haunted?
Alan has a specific
Is it a
love of
Christine
that.
sort of scenario? Or
Yeah, oh geez,
you know, or are they competing with the devil to win somebody's soul back in a car?
Well,
situation?
It has to start just like a perfectly normal street racing movie. You establish all the stakes, and halfway through, the switch flips and becomes supernatural.
Sure. So like From Dusk Till Dawn, but street racing.
Yeah.
All right.
Great.
Done.
Vampire street racing gang.
Great. We'll put it on the books. I mean, it's, any other genre sets itself up for like franchising and sequels and everything. Was that a consideration during the process of making it? Or just, what's the state?
Well, certainly now we just love being in this world. So we're like, how can we make sequels or prequels or TV spinoffs or whatever? But while writing it and while making it, I wasn't thinking about any of that. And I felt this way with The Ranger too. I'm just focused on, I want to make like a complete story. I'm hopeful that the story will feel like it expands beyond the beginning and the start time and the end time of the movie and the first and the last page of the script to feel like a whole world. But I want the movie to feel totally complete.
Yeah.
So that was my goal with it.
Yeah, at Q&As we get asked a lot about could the story go on, where could it go from here, and we're entertaining some ideas. So we'll see what the future holds.
Yeah. I mean, I will say it's sort of a perfect ending in that way because it lends itself very well to kind of what is the next chapter, but also I can assume what I think the next chapter is, and I feel like I've seen the movie and I'm satisfied with that, and it's kind of, it works well both ways. Yeah. It's interesting, interesting thinking about sequels while you're working on it. So though The Ranger, your first film, is not super relevant to demonic summoning, I would be remiss to not corner you about it while I have you here. So The Ranger is an incredibly fun film, and it was your first feature, is that right?
It was my first feature as a director.
And again, I'm going to read the log line for anyone who hasn't seen it. Teen punks, on the run from the cops and hiding out in the woods, come up against the local authority, an unhinged park ranger with an axe to grind, which is a perfect description. And I will just say right off the bat that this film stars our friend Jeremy Holm, who is an incredible actor, an incredible human. And it's just like such a surprising and beautiful and horrifying performance from Jeremy in this film. So I just want to start with that. So, okay, again, how would you describe the essence of The Ranger?
With The Ranger, I wanted to bash together 80s punk movies and 80s slashers and then give the whole thing a Lisa Frank color palette.
Yeah.
That's fun.
That's exactly how that feels exactly right. What was the process for making The Ranger compared to The Sacrifice Game?
The Ranger was much more handmade. It was a group of friends got together, all my buddies at Glass Eye Picks. We'd been working together on a couple of movies. So I had made a movie called Like Me. James Seward was the DP on that. He came over to The Ranger. There were a couple of other people that we'd just been making movies together, and we went out into the woods and we made this movie together. The Sacrifice Game was a union crew in Canada, an amazing crew, but they were all people that I met for the first time when I went to Canada. The producers introduced me to people.
Right.
So it was just a different kind of process.
Yeah.
The Ranger is kind of like you got a punk band in a garage and you're all learning how to play your instruments and you're making killer sounds. Whereas the Sacrifice Game, it's like you've gotten together like a roadies and a whole tour, and now you're like putting on big arena concerts.
Yes. Yes.
Not to give anything away again for anyone who hasn't seen it, but the Ranger, the role of the Ranger, again, played by Jeremy, is such a specific role. How did you come to figure out like who the right person would be for that?
So the Ranger, I co-wrote it. It was originally written by my friend Jocko Farino. We were in college together. We were both majoring in screenwriting, and this was his like senior thesis in 2008. And I was just a fan of the idea. I was like, yo, that's awesome. I hope you get an A on your thesis. I want to see that someday. Then fast forward to 2014, I produced a couple of things and I wanted to figure out what I wanted to direct as my first feature. And I remembered The Ranger and I was like, yo, Jocko, can you find that script? Can we work on it together? Fast forward to 2016, which is the script's done and we're starting to put it together and talk to producers and financiers. And we're talking about casting, and Jocko had worked with Jeremy and he suggested him to me. And I was like, of course, like I knew Jeremy from House of Cards and from Mr. Robot. I had watched both of those shows. And we met with Jocko and I met with Jeremy and his manager, Lori. I feel like Jeremy and Lori were trying to like scope us out and be like, are they real? Is this? But they were into it, and Jeremy really liked the script. And Jeremy, as soon as I met Jeremy in person, he gave me a big hug, and that's just his essence. For anybody who meets him, like there's just so much love emanating from this man. He's so amazing to hang out with, to be in the same space with. He's just like so much fun. And I remember that he was in preparation for the movie. He's just started watching like horror movie after horror movie. He's like, I'm going to be the expert in horror. By the time we shoot, I'm going to have seen like, I think he watched maybe 200 horror movies in anticipation of shooting this. And also his background is like, he grew up in the mountains, I believe in Colorado. He has like a very mountainy background. He lives in Vermont now. He just totally understood the character, and it was such a blast to get to dive into it with him.
Yeah, I love that. I love the origin story of that. And also, speaking of actors, Chloe Levine is in both of your films, which I always kind of look out for with filmmakers because it's such a testament to that actor and the experience you had together. But you tell us a little bit about Chloe and your relationship there.
Yeah, so I met Chloe at South by Southwest in 2017, which was when we were casting for The Ranger. And she was in a movie called The Transfiguration, which was playing South by. And I saw it, and I was like, totally loved her vibe. And then we met there at South by, and we just totally clicked. And I knew leaving South by, I was like, I want her to play Chelsea. And we were going to be shooting like the next month. So It was a very quick turnaround. But she was really into the script. She was really into the role. We started bonding over music. And I do this with every actor. I like to create playlists for them, and we pass music back and forth and stuff. And we had a great time on The Ranger, and coming out of The Ranger, she became like one of my best friends. She was a bridesmaid at my wedding, Sean and my wedding. And when we started writing The Sacrifice Game, I was writing it with her in mind for the role of Rose. And it's really cool when you get to work with somebody who you've worked with before, but also somebody who's just become a really good friend. Yeah. Because you just know their nuances. You know the way their voice moves, their inflections, the kinds of looks that they give. Yeah. It's just like, it's so. And it was just so lovely when we got on set for The Sacrifice Game, we just like sank right back into our creative relationship, like super easily, super fast, which on a movie with an ensemble piece with 8 characters, it was nice that I was like, okay, like Chloe, I'm good with. I can begin forming my relationships with the other actors who were all people that I hadn't worked with before. So yeah, both The Ranger and Sacrifice Game, it was a total blast getting to work with Chloe.
Oh, that's great. And Alan, you've actually worked with Chloe before.
I did. We did King Jack together.
Oh, so cool.
Is it fair to assume that it's better to be able to write a role with the actor in mind? Or do you like the process of making the character, then shaping the actor to meet the role?
I don't feel like I ever shape anyone to meet a role. First of all, I feel like it comes very naturally. Like when I'm writing, I'm either thinking about the role as somebody that I know, an actor that I know, or an actor that I'm aware of. Like there's some actor, that's usually how I write. And it's very instinctive, and I'm not really thinking too much about it, like logically. I'm just like, oh, this is obviously this type of person and this is that type of person, and I'm just kind of casting them in my mind, whether or not that actually turns into a reality ever.
Or even could. I think we can say in the Sacrifice game, there's a character who's a Vietnam vet who's fallen in with this gang, played by Derek Johns. The character name is Grant. And in that particular case, when Jenn and I were working on that script together, we talked a lot about the Vincent D'Onofrio character in Full Metal Jacket.
Yeah. That,
not to say that we copied that character, but that was sort of like a template for us to start with. Again, going back to looking outside the genre for influences. And we didn't know if we could find somebody who had Vincent D'Onofrio energy. Those are big shoes to fill. But we were really thrilled when we saw Derek's audition, and we're like, yes, this guy captures what it was we had in mind and brings so many other new things to the role.
Yeah.
And same thing with Laurent, who plays Doug in the Sacrifice game. We were thinking of like a Steve Buscemi type. So when we were writing, I had Steve Buscemi's voice in my head, like young Steve Buscemi. And it's like, I don't know, are we ever going to find that guy? And then we found Laurent. And it was very exciting with Laurent and Derek, just the feeling of like, oh my God, you guys exist. And then, of course, they took those roles and poured themselves into it and brought so much life. Like our writing, they were more like caricatures, and then they breathe the life into the roles. So yeah, but with Chloe specifically on Sacrifice Game, knowing she was who I had in mind. So it was kind of like this world of like, oh, what if you have young Vincent D'Onofrio and young Steve Buscemi, and Chloe is this character, just this weird combination of people.
Very cool.
The interesting thing is, to tease a little bit about a project we're working on a feature, and it won't be in the world, I'm sure, for a very long time. But the one character the one actor we knew was sort of on board before everything was finalized was Jeremy Holmes' character. So he's the one a character that I sort of wrote knowing that it would be him. And it's interesting, it's they're both great ways to do it, but it's fun to hear how other people think about it. So we've hinted at this already, but I have to ask about this because I think it's such a fun mechanic. Both the Ranger and the Sacrifice Game are period pieces. And I think how you kind of handle making period pieces in an independent film way is also very brilliant. And we've talked about this a lot. You guys have talked about this a lot, like having contained worlds and, setting something in the woods or in an abbey. And so it makes sense financially and other things. But what draws you to setting a story in a specific time period versus like in modern day?
For both the Ranger and Sacrifice Game, I felt that those time periods like made a lot of sense emotionally to the stories that we were telling. Like I don't feel like I have to forever only do these kinds of period pieces. I'm excited for someday getting to do something modern or futuristic or something really dating, doing 1800s or 1600s would be cool. But it's kind of like, I like to think about it like, what world does the story want to take place in? And then I always find that I'm infusing and that's what I think is actually really cool, to look at a time period through a modern sensibility. That I find that really fun.
And I think it helps the project stand out because, it takes a little bit of effort, and it takes a little bit of creativity and ingenuity to create a period. Maybe you don't have access to cars. Maybe you don't have access to wardrobe. Like it can be challenging, but not insurmountably so. But if you achieve it, then you stand out because there's a million movies that came out this year that are set now. And there's a handful of movies that came out that were set then.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's also selfishly just like a fun experience to get to dive into a time period. And then while you're making the movie, the whole process, literally from prep through the movies coming out, is like, well, would this car have made sense in that time period? Oh no, it came out too late, so no, we can't use that. Or like every single detail of the movie, you're constantly like asking yourself these questions. You're diving into the world of that time period of that year. You're talking to each of your department heads about what makes sense, what is the right production design, what are the right set dressing, what's the right costumes. And it's not just like that year, but it's everything leading up to that year, because the clothes we wear, the things we keep around us, is not just like the things that came out
right
this year. It's things that we've accumulated over the course of our lives. So all that is just very fun to think about.
You have to think about it and work on it, but you also have to recognize that there's going to be limitations and not be a perfectionist about it. There are going to be, somebody's going to spot, oh, that style of coat didn't exist at that time. Right. Or, that light fixture is really from 10 years later than when you say it's from. And, that's, as long as it's not something egregious that takes you out of the movie, you show your script to people who are alive at that time, talk to them about what it looked like. One of the things we learned along the way, there's a phone call to the police in our movie. It's not a phone call to 911 because in 1971, there was no 911. No. You had to call the operator or call the police station. So if we put 911 in there, a few people might have picked up on that, not too many, but we're happy we caught that particular detail.
Yeah.
Neat, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Somebody had to invent 911 and it came around at a certain time. And then Jenn's been really creative with music in terms of period appropriate music, and then knowing when to break with that and being, now music to sort of make that connection between the era and contemporary, because that's what feels right for the scene. So you can make a whole soundtrack of nothing but period songs if that's what your movie needs. But these movies are sort of fantasies as well as period pieces. So we can break with that a little bit. And Jenn, I think, does a really fun job of mixing it up.
Yeah, I'm very concerned about the emotional logic.
Yeah.
That's like the number one concern, is like, okay, maybe this song wasn't exactly from this era. It's like, it's finding that balance, because sometimes, for instance, talking about music, maybe the song wasn't from that era, but it captures the era, and it sets the scene on the right emotional foot, and it puts the viewer in the right place to go on this very specific emotional journey. So finding that balance between being period appropriate or period accurate, but emotionally, like, what's emotionally right for this journey is a fun thing to explore.
Both films too just have such great soundtracks, and I think you do a great job with all of that. Was the next thing I wanted to talk about, was the music, because they're perfect. Like it's just so much fun. Like I've left both of them being like, okay, these are songs now that I need to like look up and listen to.
Yay. Well, we have great music supervisors. We worked with a great music supervisor, Mida Goodwin, on The Ranger, and then a company, AMG, on The Sacrifice Game. And in both situations, one of my favorite parts of the process is when, like, you have your whole cut and then you start working with your music supervisor and they just start feeding you music, and you get to start playing and seeing, well, what happens to the scene if you put a song like this underneath it, or how does the tone change if you put this other kind of song underneath it. And that's just always, like, when I get to that stage, I'm always just having so much fun.
Yeah
And Mida is such a great, unsung hero of The Ranger, because not always a music supervisor. I actually don't know how many other music supervisor credits Mida has, maybe a ton, but Mida was a punk booker and promoter.
Yeah, he was a promoter
on the West Coast from the more or less the era where the movie is set. So he knew all of these bands. He was able to reach out to them and said, "Hey, do you have anything unreleased? We're making a punk rock horror movie." Unsurprisingly, a lot of punk rock musicians love horror. Go figure. And would you want your song to be in it? So many of them said yes. They sent over tons and tons of songs for Jenn to listen to. Bands like the Avengers, like really iconic bands you've heard of. And it's such a terrific soundtrack because of Mida's personal relationships and able to facilitate getting those guys involved.
That's so cool.
Love working with professionals. Just like when people really know their craft and just they're going to give you a good options of like good or better.
Yeah, good or better. That's what we had. It was great.
Do you ever scare yourselves when you are writing, filming a scene? Like, does your work ever scare you, editing a scene?
For me, sometimes the research scares me. Sometimes the, like, lonely experience of diving deep into the subject when you're doing the research to tell the story is scary and haunting and stays with me.
I would say heartstrings. Sometimes you'll see a scene where you thought like, oh, we're going to kill this character. And then you actually see the character die and you're like, hits you way harder than you thought it would.
Yeah.
Because of the performance, because of the way the music and the sound design and all of it's clicking. That's, you kind of know once you know where all the scares are, it's hard to have that surprise element.
Mm-hmm.
But the emotion, I think, if you're doing your job right, still hits you even if it's coming.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll just share, going back to my mention of how research scares me. I'm developing a project about serial killers right now, and I'm diving deep into serial killer history. It's fucking scary as hell and haunting, and I feel like every day I'm carrying all this stuff with me.
Totally can relate. I'm a big true crime person, but I went through a year or two where I was like really a true crime person, and I was reading like Ted Bundy's biography and all these books, which are...
That was a bad year.
It was a bad year. They're so fascinating and like In Cold Blood, right? Like they're so scary, and it's hard to like unlearn that stuff once you've learned it. And there's still scenes from like In Cold Blood that like I will always remember and vividly in my brain. That stuff can really imprint on you. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for being here. This was a treat for us. It was beyond fun to be able to talk to you guys about your amazing films and kind of how you think about it, and for us to like really the core of our podcast is like tracing back horror tropes and understanding the history behind them and like what they have been like in real life and how they evolved throughout the genre. And so to be able to talk to you guys about demonic summoning on your end of it, right, and kind of to illustrate how you think about it in the opposite way has been really illuminating for us. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you. It's a lot of fun.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, and tell us where we can follow you on Instagram, where we can follow your films on Instagram, and where we can watch your movies.
I am at Bubblegum and Blood on Instagram. The Sacrifice Game is at The Sacrifice Game on Instagram. And The Ranger is at The Ranger Movie on Instagram.
Awesome.
And I'm at The Redlitz in most places, but I don't know why you'd follow me because I'm not that interesting on any of those places. But you're welcome to if you want to.
And we will link everything in the description so you guys can find everything really easily. You can follow them really easily. And both films currently are on Shudder.
Yes.
And on VOD.
Yes.
Amazing. Thank you guys again for being here, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like some bonus content, consider supporting us on Patreon to access our patron-exclusive podcast, Horror Movie Club.
Also head to lunaticsproject.com to check out our spooky merch and apparel.
You can find us at Lunatics Project on Twitter and TikTok, and The Lunatics Project on Instagram and YouTube, where you'll find our short horror films, cemetery tours, and so much more.
And please rate and review. A little feedback goes a long way to help us grow and get more content out there.
Our cover art is by Pilar Kep, and musical bumpers are by Michaela Papa and Jordan Moser.